Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Hello and welcome to Reimagining Motion, a podcast from the High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, which is undertaking research into the complex issues around sustainable transport in Africa and South Asia. The HVT program is an £18 million investment by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO, and I'm your host, Holger Dagman. Welcome to today's show. Welcome to our sixth series that explores infrastructure and transport system development in South Asia and what it needs to look like in the future. The transport sector has long played a crucial role in Asian development, with a particular focus on increasing connectivity in South Asia to address poverty and boost economic growth. The development of transport infrastructures and systems, often focused on road transport, has led to rapid urbanization and growth, but brings its own challenges. Motor vehicle numbers from 2- and 3-wheelers to passenger cars in Asia are doubling every 6 years and becoming a major source of greenhouse gases, air pollution and congestion. At the same time, the region also carries a disproportionate burden of extreme weather events from climate change that has catastrophic impacts on infrastructure and people's lives. The South Asian region is home to more than 2 billion people, as well as some of the most daunting transport challenges. As transport planners, policymakers and investors strive to keep up with the demands of the growing population and economies, we ask the question if parts of the community are being left behind. Are the more vulnerable groups failing to have transport that meets the routes they need to take, that's affordable, safe, and free from threats of violence and harassment? And I'm very delighted to be exploring these questions today with Dr. Kalpana Viswanath. She is the co-founder and CEO of Safetipin, a social enterprise that uses technology and apps to collect data for the safe movement of women in urban spaces and toward gender-responsive urban systems. She founded Safetipin in 2013 to combat increasing violence against women and girls in public spaces. Besides Safetipin, she serves as a board member of the Partnership for Sustainable Low Carbon Transport SLOCAT and the International Center for the Prevention of Crime in Canada, as well as 2 Indian NGOs, Jagori and Swayam. From 2009 until 2012, she researched in countries like Tanzania, Russia, Argentina, and India for the Gender Inclusive Cities project. She started her career at the Jagori Women's Resource Center in 2000, and she holds a PhD in sociology with specialization on women's movement from the University of Delhi. So there's much more also to say about her, but also I rather to speak directly with her. So welcome, Kalpana. Thanks for joining us today. How are you doing today?
Doing well.
Thanks also for joining us, and let's get immediately started about the general challenges we're facing when it comes to the infrastructure and transport services, particularly so for vulnerable road users. A key component of any infrastructure has to be that it caters for all of its users. It needs to be inclusive. Yeah, we know also that transport all over the world is not inclusive, certainly not inclusive for women and girls. Speaking as somebody who has dedicated many years to understanding the challenges that women and girls face when they travel, could you describe the gender gap in the South Asia region and places where you work?
Yeah, thank you, Holger. So as you said, it's 2 billion of the world's population lives in this region, which is nearly 1 out of 4 people on this globe are South Asians. On the gender gap, it's a mixed bag, but we tend to perform quite poorly because this is a region which is, I think, beset with several problems of history, of patriarchy, economic challenges, and I think moving out of poverty, and most of the countries have now moved into low and middle income countries. But the gender gap, even according to the Global Gender Gap Report, which comes out globally of measuring 153 countries, we feature somewhere between 70 and 1 in 30. So, really it's in the lower half of the issues on gender equality and gender equity. For example, even on something like the gender pay gap in this region is actually 33%. That is, men earn 33% more than women across occupations, compared to a global, which is 24%. I think there are three broad issues that we need to kind of focus on when we look at gender equity in mobility and transport. One is the issue of violence and sexual harassment and safety that is faced. I know that, a few years ago, the Cornell University had done a study across 16 countries, and they found that over 80% women, and this was the sample of about 16,000 people, women had reported they had faced some kind of sexual harassment while traveling in public transport. So we are talking about a very big problem. I mean, the WHO says that 1 out of 3 women has faced violence. In the transport sector, we specifically find, so for example, in India, there have been several studies in Delhi, a study by UN Women said that nearly 90% women in Delhi had said they had faced some kind of sexual harassment. Women talk about how they changed their travel mode because of lack of safety, lack of good mobility. So this is a global issue, but it's very prevalent in the South Asian region, across Indian cities and other cities in the region. And the reason why it's so important is because the lack of safety has an impact on the lives of women and girls, which is well beyond an act of violence. What happens is because of lack of safety, women have less access to opportunities. So certain jobs you may not take up, if there isn't good public transport. I think the important point is that the lack of safety impacts women and girls' right to the city and their access to opportunities for education and employment and leisure. Leisure is so, it's not even part of the discourse, right? Because we're talking with there's education, employment, and government program that's saying we need to improve it. But, the right to the city includes well-being, urban well-being, the ability to go to a park, enjoy, do some exercise. And actually, you will find that across South Asia, public spaces tend to be male-dominated. And I think this is an important thing we need to understand. The second issue which we need to look at when we talk about gender and urban mobility and equity is the work of care. And I think this is an important one, that women and men tend to move around the city differently because the burden of the work of care falls on women. So in Asia and the Pacific, women spend 4 times more of their time on unpaid care work. Now, these are big numbers, okay? I mean, there are things like we said that 16.4 billion hours per day are spent on unpaid care work across the world. So until the transport decision-making begins to recognize that women move differently, and part of the reason they move differently is because they bear the burden of care work, which includes not only childcare, but also elderly care. For example, worldwide, 2.1 billion people needed care in 2015, and this is expected to reach 2.3 billion people by 2030. So we're talking about, a world where we cannot look at transport as, just, people going to work in the morning and coming back in the evening, right? At the end of the day, there are children, there are young people, there are women, there are elderly, there are people with disabilities. So I think what we need to do is actually have a transport system which is much more caring, which responds to the needs of care. And therefore, I say that we need a caring transport system which recognizes that some people, need to climb on differently, need a little more time to get onto a bus. So I think these are the 2 big issues which the transport system and transport decision-making needs to focus on to truly become gender equitable. And the third one, which we can maybe discuss a little later, is really the issue of women in the transport sector.
Thanks, Kalpana, also for painting a challenging picture, which is not just for South Asia, but also it really also covers the entire the entire world, and really highlighting the issues around violence, but also the access to opportunities, and highlighting also the importance of the roles of care as well as women in the sector. And we will come back to that a little bit later in the podcast. Let us get us to your first issue, which you highlighted, the terrible violence and sexual harassment almost all women and girls are facing around the world, but also in the parts you living. And you said it's really not just about the act itself, but also it's stopping women and girls participating in all kinds of events, including access schools, accessing employment, and so on. So you shared some of the studies, and we're here with the HVT podcast, there's a covering also research. But do you have the impression that there is enough research? Do we have still a knowledge gap here, or do we have more an implementation and action gap, or both?
Well, I would say to some extent both. I think there is now, over the past 10, 15 years, there is enough data coming out of, whether it's universities, whether it's more research-oriented organizations, or even from the NGO sector, that is showing that, women move differently, and the fear of violence is a constant companion that women carry around as they move across the city. It's, of course, it's different in different cities. It's different at different times of the day. Certainly when after dark, it gets worse. Before dark, it's a little better. So I think we need more data specifically on what is the impact of this lack of safety? Because sometimes if we just look at the lack of safety as, violence is taking place, I think that the need is to understand what is the impact of this, and how does it impact even something as large as the economy of a country. The impact of all this is not just on women, but it's actually even on countries, on families, on communities, on the way that we look at development. So I think I do like to put this within the larger context of the right to the city. So that is one on the level of data collection. I think we need a lot more granular data about how this impacts. And I would say actually, in some senses, we also need some regular victimization surveys to understand. Because if we focus only on crime statistics, what happens is they're incomplete. Because a lot of sexual harassment on public transport is unreported, right? Because you're moving in a bus, you're standing, waiting for a bus, and something happens. It is very unlikely you're going to go and report that as a crime, unlike other forms of crime, which, domestic violence now, which get reported more. So it's actually one of the most unreported crimes. And therefore, we need to find other ways of measuring it. And I think we need innovative ways of measuring it. And these can be a wide range of things. There are apps where women talk about their experiences. So those can be looked at as data. There are, I think looking at even enrollment in different universities and colleges, especially to see, is there less enrollment for women who have to travel further? For example, there was one study that was done by the World Bank, which talked about how in Delhi, girl students did not take admission in colleges which were further away because they had to travel more. So sometimes you're giving up an opportunity for better education. So I think the impact of this is what needs to be measured more. But certainly on the other side, implementation is where a lot of work is needed to be done. Like our transport department, our transport planners having gender diversity at the table when there's planning taking place, right? It cannot be, let's just add, one extra bus here at this time, or something which is like a kind of a tokenistic response sometimes to the problem, is not going to have enough of an impact. I think we need a more systemic response to it, and which has to begin at the phase of planning, of designing the transport system. And really in the context of, I think, sustainable transport today, right? We're talking so much about decarbonization, sustainable transport. We're talking about transition. Even in this debate, right from the beginning, we need to bring in gender inequity, not later. So, I'm saying that you don't say, okay, first we solve this problem and then we solve this problem. I think the SDGs have taught us that all the global problems are linked. And so therefore you need to actually look at the intersectionalities between different problems in the way that you design the solutions. And we need innovation, we need resources, we need brave steps, we need to listen to the diversity, and then only we are going to actually move towards gender equity. I think we're still pretty far away from it.
Thanks, Kalpana. I'd like to go back to one specific element you mentioned before we heading to your groundbreaking work. On the data side, you said also we need to really fulfill the right to the city. We need also more granular data. Can you give us a little bit of example what that actually means?
Yeah. Okay. So for example, when we talk about granular data, I'm saying it has to be a combination of quantitative and qualitative data, and I think that is the one thing that is important. So, for example, if we look at, I'll tell you in a low-income neighborhood in Delhi, right? How do the young women actually move? Are they limited by lack of infrastructure? Are they physical infrastructure, transport infrastructure, affordability, safety, accessibility, right? So we know there are many factors which play a role. And I think we need to begin to unpack it, because if we just say, oh, women are not able to move around, we need to sometimes define what exactly the factors that influence it. And so I think the granularity to me is the both numbers. So I think we do need what I'm talking about, these large-scale surveys, because they do serve a purpose in really convincing policymakers that the problem is not a small problem. But on the other side, for the granularity, we also need the narratives. We need the stories. And the stories are in the millions, Okay, if you look at it, what is urban life? The urban life entails the ability to move around. And if you cannot move around equally, so it's almost like the fundamental aspect of urban life, right? It's the fundamental aspect of human life to be able to move around in a sense, And so when you don't have the ability to move around fearlessly, affordably, and in a way that is accessible to you at all stages of your life, when we talk about, for example, disability access, we must understand that disability is not just people who are currently disabled. At any point of our lives, we could also be partially disabled. You could break a leg, you could break an arm, you could be having to move a wheelchair, you could be in a wheelchair. All of us are getting older, So I think that data somehow that nuances it and doesn't make it seem as if it's a problem that somebody else has to face. Right? Somewhere it has to come into the mainstream. I think currently it's still mainstream planning does this, and let's add an element of equity. And I think the data which we needed to say, this is the mainstream, not this, I think there was recently, I read some statistics in Asia Pacific that only 30% of the population is in the age group of men between 18 and 59. So, 2/3 of the population is all the others, So that is the mainstream. It's really high time that we stopped looking at the able-bodied male as who we are designing our transport system for.
Well, thanks for sharing that, and really also plea for a more inclusive, more holistic, and really also integrative also planning. As you said, we will all face at some stage sooner or later to get us into another group. So and face also those challenges. As I mentioned in my introduction, you founded Safetipin in 2013. So tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
So Safetipin, you're right, they are more than 10 years old now. And we have been doing, our mission is really to build a city where women's voices are heard and women can move around without fear. And we've done a wide range of things across the world in cities, in emerging economies, around safety. So safety is a very big element. So around that, we've done a lot of work on safety in transport. We've done, especially looking at last mile connectivity, because we know that a lot of transport systems exist. So you may have a bus, you may have a metro, but women have to reach the metro, women have to reach the bus. How do we make the last mile safe for women? And I think that's one of the areas that we've done a lot of work around. How do we build systems? How do we get policies that enable women to actually move around freely? So I think safety has been an entry point for us, because especially in India, I think safety for women is a big concern, and I think some of the cities are better than others, but, the city I live in, Delhi, it is known to be a rather unsafe city for women. And I think our work in Delhi, for example, we did some mapping through using our tools, our technology tools. We have several technology tools for collecting data. And one of the data points that we, in 2016, we were able to show was that there were nearly 8,000 points in the city, which were what we call dark spots. It was absolutely pitch dark. There was no lighting at all. And we worked with the Delhi government to actually use that data to improve lighting. And when we redid the mapping of the city in 2019, we found that it had gone down to less than 2,000 points where there were dark spots. So, so something like just improving lighting is a big one. Another thing we had done in a few cities in India was to look at this, mobility at metro stations and at bus stops. So we give safety scores to metro stations and bus stops. So what we are able to do is we are able to, measure what would make a space safe, and then we do the measurement of these places. So, and then we share that with the local government or the transport departments and give them recommendations of what they could do. So this could be improving lighting, this could be having active street fronts, this could be having good public toilets, this could be having good waiting places, organizing last mile transport. So this is a second sort of set of things that we do. We've also recently we have a framework called She Rises, which is looking at a systemic approach to gender responsive urbanization. So we're talking about safe, inclusive, responsive, and equitable urban systems. And what we're doing is we've come up with a set of about 30 indicators that we measure cities on in terms of public transport, in terms of public infrastructure, other services, and response to gender-based violence, to then give cities a kind of some action plan of how they can improve it. So the work that we do is on a wide range of levels, which is collecting data, giving technical assistance to city governments and transport departments, working with NGOs and other civil society organizations to build their capacity on using data as well, because a lot of NGOs and others are, they have a lot of good work, but they're not sometimes able to translate their data into policy, strong policy advocacy. So we try and support them on that.
Thanks, Kalpana. And again, there's a congratulations for all the work you have done so far. And really also sharing also your approach from data to impact, in fact, and making also the policy change. I'd just like to get for a moment to the technology and the data part. So tell us a little bit more about what kind of technology you're using. Tell us a little bit more about also your tech approach.
So we actually began as an app when we started in 2013. So we built an app called My Safetipin. And Safetipin is spelled with an I, Tipin. So the My Safetipin app was using the tool known as the safety audit. So the safety audit is a kind of a participatory tool whereby we defined 8 parameters, which were things like lighting, accessibility, walkability, availability of security, things like that. So anybody in the world can open the app, do a safety audit, and that data becomes part of the data pool, and they can also see all the data. So the idea was, can we get citizen-led data? Can we get people to talk about what they feel, where they feel safe and unsafe? And that's how the crowdsourced data part of it began. And we have several other features within the app, which includes, a safe route, nearby places, like where is the nearest park, where is the nearest bus stop, where is the nearest public toilet. So it's really trying to give useful data for people, especially women, to access a city better. But in addition to that, we have two other tools that we use. One is called Safetipin Night. Safetipin Night is it's a tool an app through which we actually send out cars in cities with the app on the dashboard and generate images of the street. And then we use those images to map the entire street network on things like lighting, walkability. So we did this mapping in 2014, and it was really, at that time, we used to say, a really cheap version of Google. And of course, now everybody has a dashboard, the camera thing because of the Ubers and stuff like that. But really, at that time, we even experimented with having a little box sitting on top of the car and trying to collect data. So this gives us an ability to collect very large-scale data. And what we also have done in the past few years is we're actually using machine learning on these images. So it's not just, we began with sort of human calculation and assessment of the images, but now we use machine learning to assess the images in terms of the lighting. And on our app, we have a very interesting feature called Quick Audit, where you can try it. If you step out of your home and take a photograph of a place, our algorithm will tell you what is the safety score of that place, and you can say,
wow,
yeah. And the third tool that we have is called Safetipin Site, SITE, which is a kind of a qualitative spatial tool for collecting data. So what it does is that we do use this a lot for our last mile connectivity studies, say at a metro station. So you can do qualitative data collection, you can do interviews, you can do spatial data, you can do photography. So it's like a bit of a kind of a Google form, but with spatial and photographic data. So we use the whole thing to give very in-depth data to stakeholders about how to improve a public space. So we constantly upgrade our technology, and technology is an expensive thing. We're a small organization, but it has been one of our defining features right from the beginning to give very simple, low-cost technology that can give very useful data towards bringing about social urban change.
Thanks, Kalpana. Obviously, there are other ways. There are more initiatives around us, the gender gaps, to make transport more inclusive. But what needs actually to be done by local and national government? You highlighted already examples like sharing the light, changing the lighting you shared in terms of bringing us data into the mainstream of cities. What else needs to be done to really close this gender gap?
So one of the things that I briefly began mentioning in the beginning was the women in the transport sector, right? So this is a big area because currently in Asia and South Asia, it's less than 20% of the transport sector is made up of women or people of any other non-binary genders. And even globally, it's quite low. I think it's less than 30%, even in the developed world. So I think this is a big area, and I think whether it's having women on your trains, on buses, in electric vehicles, I think it's just you need a lot more of, I think just diversity at the planning stages itself. So I think there have been a lot of interesting examples, whether it's been, having training women to become taxi drivers. There are some very good organizations in India and in other parts of even South Asia which are doing this work. I think looking even at the new area of electric vehicles, How do we ensure that right from the beginning, we bring in gender diversity into using that? I know there's some interesting examples in India itself around, in Odisha, one state where as part of one project that I think 80 transgender people were trained to drive auto rickshaw drivers. Similarly, in Kochi, the Kochi Metro, there's been an effort to do that. The ITF, the Workers' Federation, I think is focusing a lot on women in the transport sector. Last year, we had a large event where we looked at, how to build a feminist transport system, where we really looked at the voices of women workers, whether it's in rail or bus or metro. So I think that is one big area that needs to be looked at.
We are 6 years before the end of the era of the Sustainable Development Goals of this phase in 2030. What do you see as could or should change by then in terms of transport and the focus of inclusive and gender-related transport?
I think that's a difficult one. We don't seem to be on the path to achieving very much of the 2030 goals, even now, when we're 6 years away. And I think that is worrying for most countries. But I think we do have 6 years and, we continue beyond that. I think some of the key elements we need to do is to recognize the linkages between some of the different goals, And I said, so for example, I do know there's a lot of focus. Many agencies are focusing on decarbonization. And I think that's an important debate. I think in Asia, it's a big one to look at in South Asia and Asia. But how do we make the decarbonization debate also look at inclusion, right? So how do we look at moving people out of poverty while we're talking about decarbonization? How do we make it that is looking at gender justice? So I think that is one. The other area, I think that, we're still very far from on gender equity. I mean, it seems a recent statistic I read that we are still about 230 years away from gender equity if we move at this rate. So some of these statistics are depressing. And as I think some of the things we really need to speed up on, I think, the climate, I think the heat, the climate change, the heating up of the planet is a big one. And I think our work with young people is really reflecting that, as we look at what people talk about Gen Z, millennials, how they're making different decisions very differently because they're looking at the future very differently. I think it's important to have young people's voices, and I think a lot of UN agencies are doing that. But to me, I think the issue of heat, the issue of sustainable transport, the issue of moving people out of poverty, because at the end of the day, the impact of heat, the impact of air pollution, the impact of all extreme climate events are faced mostly have the largest impact on the most vulnerable. So whether it's the poor, whether it's the people in rural areas, whether it's women because they carry the burden of care. So I think I really feel it is extremely important for those who are working on different areas to not work in silos and to recognize that each of the sustainable development goals is linked to the others. You cannot have gender equity if you continue to have poverty. You cannot have, I think, clean air and clean water if you don't address poverty. So I think the linkages between different goals is something that is very important. And I think to me, the goal on partnerships is the big one. Whether it's at the level of a Safetipin, which is a small organization, whether it's HVT, which is looking at it at a much larger level, or whether it's at the level of nation states, member states, who need to actually build those alliances. Because I think today the challenges facing us are very large, are extremely large, and they are complex. So there is really no silver bullet solution to any single problem. And in the face of that, we also have, I think, changes in government. We have, the growth of the right wing. We have global conflicts. We have war. We have, so I think it's some moments one feels a sense of, that the problems are very large. But I think the Global Development Goals, in a sense, by defining it, by putting, targets to it, makes it more achievable. And I still have hope. I think, I would not be working in this area if I was not basically born optimist that we can make a difference as people. But I think we can make a difference as in partnerships, in collaboration. I think donors, I think member states, I think the United Nations need to understand that, that this is a moment to build partnerships and collaborations, because none of us can solve these problems on our own. And it has to be, and social change cannot be a process where the bottom line is either profits or personal glory or anything. It must be about solving these very, very, some people call them wicked problems. I call them complex problems, which need systemic approaches. And that's where I come to this from. I think what I would share with listeners and to anyone who is interested in this area is that we can make a difference. First, as individuals. Secondly, as parents, as community leaders, and then in larger collectives, then as members of as citizens, we can. Truly, people can make the difference, and I think it's from the individual choice of how you want to be more sustainable, but also what you can influence. I don't think it's enough to say, I won't use plastics, but what can you influence beyond that? It is certainly important to say, I will walk and I will bicycle more, but what more can you do? How can you influence larger agendas? There is no time to rest on any laurel, so I think there is only work to be done, and each one of us must do that. We must work together. And as this world becomes more urban, I think that's also something we should look at. How do we make our urban spaces more livable for people?
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to learn more about the work of our guests or check out any of the resources mentioned, they are all linked in the episode description. I also encourage you to check out the other episodes in this series and leave us a rating, as it really helps people find our work. And finally, you can learn more about the work of HVT at our website, transport-blinks.com, or follow us on LinkedIn at High Volume Transport Applied Research. The HVT program is an £18 million investment by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. HVT is providing a new body of research to help inform the decisions of policymakers and planners and make road and rail transport greener, safer, and more accessible, affordable, and inclusive. My name is Holger Dogman, and you have been listening to Reimagining Motion. Goodbye and auf Wiedersehen.